What's up, everyone? It's Monday. Welcome to another stream on the Msl module and Reactor collaboration here. Morning, Rebecca. Or afternoon. It's
Hello.
afternoon for you, right?
It's afternoon, yeah. Yep, New York. So we're just hitting the early afternoon right now.
We are
I
indeed.
still feel like it's the morning. I'm on my second cup of coffee, so
Yeah, everybody needs some coffee in the morning.
Mondays.
It's Mondays.
Yeah,
Yeah, I know.
especially Mondays.
Tell me
Yep.
about it.
Yep.
Uh,
So thank you again, Christos, for running this session.
Solo.
For anybody joining us from the Reactor side, he is the co-host of the 425 show, which runs weekly, 2 times a week. So definitely check them out. Do a quick search. We'll drop the link to their show and channel into the chat. This is the third session of an ongoing identity series, and today we'll be covering the third module as well, 3 and 3, permissions and consent framework. So if you didn't tune in for any of the last 2 sessions, they are recorded. They're available on our YouTube. I'll drop the link to the YouTube as well. This session will run for approximately 2 hours. If you can't stay for the full length of it, feel free to drop off and we'll have it recorded. You can always reach out to myself or to Christos through his channels if you have questions related to the content down the line, or come back next week because we'll be doing it again.
Again and again.
Again and again.
For eternity. Identity for eternity, right? Why not?
Forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So, speaking of, so he's an identity expert. He's part of the identity advocacy group with Microsoft Identity Division here at Microsoft. So
We are indeed. As much as we can.
inundated identity.
Yes. So thanks for the
Awesome.
fantastic intro. Feel free to stay and learn with us, or drop off and you can join us at any time. I'll have you always on OBS Ninja. So anytime you can drop in, just let me know.
Okay,
And
awesome.
we're ready to kick this off, right?
Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. Good morning, friends. What's up? Okay, so up until this point, we've been doing our Implement Microsoft Identity Associate Learn module, which should actually get you some certification as soon as you get there and finish. So the previous 2 weeks, we've done the first part, getting started with Microsoft Identity, and then we did the application types in Microsoft Identity. Today, we have something super exciting, which is permissions and consent. And we'll learn how to acquire permissions to call other APIs or to get profile information, and how these things should work across the board. So if you are all ready, by the way, this is all recorded. So if you haven't had a chance to do the previous 2 modules, we have them on our channel. It's on the React channel as well. We'll drop the links on the chat. So if you really need to go and catch up, then you can do so. However, most of these modules are standalone as well, which means that you don't really have to do the previous ones to do the current one. So if you're just dropping in for the first time, we'll go through some terminology today that you might find new, but you can quickly catch up, and I will try to explain as we go through. Let's kick it off then. Continue. So permissions and consent. What are they? And by the way, feel free to drop messages in the chat. I'm monitoring the chat. If you have anything to say or anything to ask, feel free to let us know. And thanks everyone for joining, whether they're in the French Riviera, which I'm so jealous right now. It's sunny and hot. It's definitely not sunny and hot in Seattle. Or the UK, which I don't know if it's called or sunny. Somebody says Leeds, and we have Cardiff, and we have our usual friends. So let's do this. It's exciting. Yeah, we're not going into roles this one, Rasgrove. We're doing consents and permissions. So how to set up your permissions, API permissions for your apps, and how to acquire them in code, and how to ask them. We'll do static and dynamic as we go through. Roles are further down. Patience. One step at a time, as they say, right? So in the Microsoft Identity Platform, since we're built on top of standards, we use OAuth 2 for the authorization component, and OpenID Connect for access and ID tokens. So we have ID tokens with OpenID Connect, and we have OAuth 2 for acquiring access tokens for resources. This course has some prerequisites. It says basic knowledge of OAuth authentication flows. We don't really go into flows as much, so you don't have to worry about OAuth 2 or terminology other than the access tokens that we'll be talking about. we're going to be touching ASP.NET and JavaScript on this course. Again, everything is copy-paste, so you don't have to have extreme knowledge or deep knowledge on these subjects. I will be explaining how things are taking place, and we can use Visual Studio Code or anything else. It needs to be beginner level. Any IDE works fine. Hopefully by now you already have a Microsoft 365 tenant. If you don't, you can go back and create one through the Microsoft Developer 365 developer program, which gives you an everlasting Azure Id tenant with some sample data. So if you haven't had the chance to do it, just go and do it now so you can follow along, because you will need an account that you can have admin permissions for this coursework or for this module to work. Yep. Otherwise, you will have to run to your admin to ask for permissions for some of the stuff that we'll be writing today. And I don't want you to be in that situation, because depending on the company, it can take a long time to get those permissions implemented. So learning objectives here, compare and contrast different permission types that we support. We will touch a little bit on the V1 stuff, but we're not going to go too much because I don't want you to use the V1 endpoints for authorization. So we'll just explain some stuff about default and why it is there, the default permission or scope. Then we'll compare and contrast the differences between static and dynamic consents, which is very well supported on the V2 endpoints. And we'll create apps that support both dynamics and static permissions. And for additional resources, you can always go back and read the module here. Okay, next unit, understanding permissions and consents. So what is this? Let me click on this one. Okay. So if you are going to write an application that authenticates users, usually it's not given, but usually you want to access some additional resources behind the scenes. That can be an API, our API, our APIs, Azure, Graph, or other resources. It could be one of your own APIs or resources. And then it could be things like SQL Server or Cosmos DB. So it can be a lot of different things there. In order for your application to be able to access these things, you need to acquire an access token. As the name says, access token. And that access token gives you access to a very specific resource. And each access token is issued for a resource. So you can't have an access token that goes and requests permissions to access both Graph and say your APIs at the same time. So it needs to be separate access tokens. And we'll see how that works. Now, in terms of types of permissions, we have delegated permissions. In effect, we're giving an app the permission to act on our behalf, on our users' behalf, to go and access some data on their behalf. So let's say you sign into the website and then you want to access data in your SQL Server or in your API, that implementation of that delegated permission, or let's say Graph permissions, it will be, the application will be acting on your behalf or the user's behalf to go and get the data. This is very common for anything that has to do with a UI implementation. So if your application provides a UI to the users to go and sign in and interact with the application, that's usually where delegated permissions come in, because this is usually the way that we expect the users to interact. But think about it, if you are creating a service that needs to go and collect data from somewhere and do some processing and requires permissions, then we're talking about application permissions. This is for anything that expects you to actually run without any user interaction or sign-in user. There will be client credentials that get passed down to Azure Id to authenticate that application, but any permission or anything that we add to that flow will be for the application itself and not for the user. And we'll see what the implications for that setup are as we go through. Okay, so effective permissions are the permissions that your app will have when making requests to the target. And there's a nice chart over here that explains that, in effect, no matter what the application permissions are, your users will never have more permissions that they're given in the Azure Active Directory tenant. So even if your application expects you to act as an admin, if you're not an admin for that tenant, you won't be able to have those permissions. So it's an intersection of the permissions that granted into the application, and then the permissions that you have in the Azure Id tenant. That's very important for certain scenarios. So just be aware that there's always this kind of intersection. Just because you define them in the app, it doesn't override the settings in your Azure Id tenant. And that's very, very important. And for the consent experience, in an OpenID Connect or Auth authorization request, the app requests the permissions that need to be assigned as scopes. And those scopes are space separated into the request. And a typical request looks like this over here. Now, mind you, let me just make this bigger so you can see it. And mind you, the carriage returns here are just for legibility. The request is just a one continuous line. And you'll notice down here in the scope, we have scopes for graph to read the calendar and graph to go and read email, or sorry, send an email, right? The other things here obviously are the client ID, which is the place that we want to go. And well, the client ID is the app registration where we provision those permissions. And then we have the endpoint. You can notice it's a V2 endpoint, which is great. That's the one we need to use. And the redirect URI, where the token is going to come back. We saw that in the previous module. The nice thing about scopes and permissions is that it creates a trust framework between your application and the users themselves. And it also establishes certain kind of best practices. So it becomes a lot more interactive, and it allows the users to accept what they want to give access to the app to. So for example, if you ever downloaded an app for your phone, you'll notice that lately the mobile operating systems are trying to make it even more prevalent and more evident to you what kind of applications your app is trying, what kind of permissions your app is trying to acquire. So if you download an app that, let's say it is a chat app, but requires access to all your pictures, you need to think about seriously whether you want to give that app access to all your pictures, or if you just download, let's say, I don't know, Reddit, and then Reddit goes and says, let me get you all your contacts, all your emails. Well, wait a minute, Reddit, why would you need access to my emails? So pay close attention to those permissions, whether you're using Azure AD or the phone. And in a very similar manner here, you'll notice that when we try to sign in, the first thing that we will be presented, if it's the first time that we're using the application, it's a set of permissions requested. And this message will pop up or will appear on your screen if you're doing a redirect that says this specific application is trying to access your profile, which is the standard OpenID Connect profile scope. Then it tries to read your email that seems to be coming from Graph, and then maintaining access to the data that you've given to. So that's the offline scope. Now here, this is like, wait a minute, it's trying to read my emails. Do I want to give it access to? You can definitely say no. And then that means that obviously it depends on how the application is coded to handle this one, but in most cases, it will probably follow off the authorization process. And that means that you won't have access to that application. So you need to go back to either reconsent or reach out to the developer to discuss that. In fact, in some cases, if you think that the app is trying to access certain things, you can also report it, and we'll see that in the pop-up as well. So sign in and read your profile is always there. Yep, for OpenID Connect, that is correct. Obviously, also you may sometimes notice that we default to user.read as the graph permission that comes out of the box. But unless you call the graph for that, you won't need to grant permission. So yes, sign in and read your profile is the basic one. So the minimum information is allowing the user to access the system, and also allowing the system to acquire some basic information about your profile, such as your username, your email, something that you might want to display to your front-end user or front-end app, Rasgo. So I hope that answers that. So requesting consent for an entire tenant. Yeah, so in some cases, you might not want to give users that kind of experience, because let's say your company acquires Box or Dropbox or something else that you want to give access to everyone out of the box without them having to go and consent every single time. So if you have 10,000 seats and everybody needs to access the same app, it will be extremely time consuming for them to have a consent every single time they access the app for the first time only, or unless the permissions change. So from that perspective, there is an admin consent endpoint that you can send your admins and they can consent on your behalf. You will also notice that if you're signing into your test tenant that we've created before for the first time, then you'll also have consent on behalf of the organization as a checkbox that allows you to also do that. And finally, inside the portal, you also have the ability to go and consent for everyone as an admin. So you provide admin consent to all the permissions. So there are 3 different ways to do that. It all comes down to how you want your admins to go and consent to that information. And you know that's exactly what I said down here. So if you are an admin, you will be presented with this checkbox every time you are presented with a consent screen. There are some best practices which are actually quite useful. So first and foremost is only ask for permissions required for the implemented app functionality, right? So don't request user consent for permissions that you may want to access in the future, but you haven't implemented yet. This is also quite nice from a dynamic consent approach as well, since we support it now on the V2. So let's say part of your apps need to have access to the user profile, and maybe, I don't know, let's say give them access to your, users provide access to their email. But there's another section of the website that also asks for permission to get the calendar information. Now, me as a user may say, well, I'm happy to use this app to read my emails, but I don't want them to have access to my calendar. That means that if the developer has coded it right, I can still use part of the application with the current permissions, i.e. my user profile and my emails. But when it asks me to provide consent for another part of the website, which needs to have access to my calendar, I can say no. Also, if they were also asking for consent to read my OneDrive, and this application does not implement OneDrive whatsoever, there's nothing in the UI or anything else, I would question why they were asking consent for access to my OneDrive. And also, I will be questioning why they're doing it if there's no implementation over there. That creates a bit of a distrust between what the app can do and what I'm giving them permission to do. In addition to requesting permissions, you should always follow the least privileged access. Rather than read all the emails in the organization, just ask for reading emails to a specific account. Or rather than being able to read and write emails for the user, just ask for user.read permissions, or mail.read permissions, just to read the emails, because that's all you're doing. So always follow the least privilege, because you don't want, if something goes wrong, for that app to have a lot more permissions to the user's data. And then apps should gracefully handle scenarios where the user does not grant consent the first time, and then they change their mind and they want to come back, and they can do that. So if the application does not receive an access token, why did not receive the access token? Why do I not have access to the application? And what happens if I want to go back and reconsent? Right. So with that, and if there are no more questions, we can actually jump to our first exercise, which will be about creating an app to use our consent framework. So let's press continue. I'll give you a couple of minutes to see if you have any questions. Otherwise, we can kick off the exercise and hopefully you can all follow along. Fun times. So on this one, we're going to use a Node app to actually go and implement some consenting to read emails, right? So let's do this. Open up your terminal of choice. I use Windows Terminal, which is one of my favorite. If you haven't used it before, I would highly recommend that. You can go and do all sorts of terminals in there as well. PowerShell, Command Prompt, Cloud Shell, it's in the box as well. And you can do your WSL as well and what have you. So right now I'm using PowerShell Core, which is open source and cross-platform, runs everywhere. Unfortunately, Terminal doesn't run everywhere, which is a bit of a bummer. So here it says, let's go this here, and then let's put this one here so we can have them side by side. So first thing we need to do is create a folder. And down here. I will name mine Reactor 3. And then I'll change directory into that. And now I can go and do npm init -y. This will initialize our Node app with the defaults. You can always go and change them. Then we want to install npm express and Morgan. So this one is going to install two different packages. Express is the UI that can run on top of Node.js apps, and then Morgan is a middleware for logging HTTP requests. You don't have to use Morgan, it's purely optional, but because the code actually uses Morgan, I would say just go with the defaults and the instructions. Over here, obviously, I'm just adding some explanation about what we're installing and why. So this will go and fetch the latest packages for that. And I think now we can just open it in code. So code dot, if you press code dot in any directory, it will open VS Code inside that directory. So let's put code on the side. And first thing we have to do is add the following script to our server.js. So let's find, we need to create a file, server.js. At the root, server.js. There you go. You can press the buttons up here to quickly create folders and let me make this bigger. To create folders and files. So server.js, just copy paste the whole thing here. So let's do that. Down here, I know you can't see everything. In effect, we're initializing our Express, we're pulling Morgan in, we're setting the port to 3007. That's where our default app is going to run. We have a static web for the front end. That's the folder where we're gonna put all our front end code, and then just a get for everything on default for that page. Okay. With me so far, I hope. Now we need to create a new folder called web. Remember, it needs to match that down here, otherwise it won't work. So let's do web, not web3. And in that folder, we need to add an index.html file. This is for our front end. So let's go and do that. Index.html. And I'm looking on the side because that's where my stream screen is. Apologies if I'm looking sideways. So now we need to add some UI, so HTML and some basic files here to pull. So if we go all the way to the top, let me hide that now. So let me save this. Don't forget to save, friends, because if you don't save, we're going to try to run stuff. It will be totally broken and you'll be wondering why. Let me close server. We don't need server anymore. We're done with that. Let me close the welcome and let me close this file so we can go through the code a little bit. I can max it out. Yeah, let's do that. I'll max it. So here we have the, we're pulling in Msl browser, which is the one library that we support for, or one of the libraries that we support, but this is the Microsoft library for Azure Id. And then we have some UI here to handle the, some buttons and some messages so we can see what's happening. Msl Config is where we define the settings for our Msl library. And then down here, you'll see we're just instantiating an Msl client, nothing else for now. So we need to add a little bit of code. So let me just find the code here. So next, scroll down. The reminder of the exercise is technically a copy-paste exercise, but we'll explain what the code is doing down here. So copy that, put it, what did it say? It says put it just above the to-do add functions. So we'll follow that. Shift Alt F. Oh, wait a minute. Where did I paste that? What happened? What? File. Okay. So I think I did not paste that right. Space here. No, it doesn't. Empty space. Interesting. Okay. Let's copy it again. I thought I copied it. Maybe I didn't. There you go. Alt Shift F, learn it. Shortcut. So this one in effect will change the UI and it will change the button from sign in to sign out depending on what the state of the current logged in user is. Okay. So that's all it does here. So next, let's see what else we have to put in there. Next, we need to add the acquire token and get user emails. That's a big function over here. again goes down here as a function. Alt-Shift-F, fix the stuff. So here, what we're doing is once the user is signed in, we get the current account, and then we try to acquire a token silently. If this user has acquired a token for our emails before, for the right scope, the request is here. I don't know if we have defined the request yet. We haven't. So here we will be passing the scopes, i.e. the permissions that we need to request an access token for. If this user has already acquired an access token in the past, it will try to acquire the token silently. So there will be no user interaction. The user will just be presented with the data. However, there are cases where this could fail because the user has not consented yet. So in that instance, we need to have an interactive session with the user to present them with a pop-up that says, hey, I want you to go and acquire a token for me with the right scopes, obviously. And then once I have my scopes, I want to go and get the messages from MSGraph, which I don't think we've implemented yet. So that will be part of the next exercise. And this is a very standard, very expected Msl paradigm. This is how, no, you cannot acquire token silent for, well, if you already have the tokens there, you need to say, graph token, equals acquire token silently for that scope, and then you can say Cosmos DB token acquire token silently, blah. So you cannot acquire resource tokens for multiple resources in the same call. You have to explicitly go and get them. The nice thing is that if they're already in the cache, you don't have to actually go and fetch them from Azure Id, and then it will silently try to fetch them as well if they have expired. But it depends, but at the same time, it is best practice to only acquire tokens when you actually need to use them. So unless you're using them all on the same page, then you might get this kind of experience where they might get 2 or 3 different consents to consent to the different permissions if they haven't done them. And if there is an account already, we'll try to get the token for you behind the scenes. So you will not be presented with a pop-up unless you need to consent, right? So that's important. It will try to see if the user is signed in, and it will try to go and acquire the token for you. So I think it's only the first time that you could say try to get 3 access tokens for 3 different resources that you haven't done before, all at the same time. It will try to do it interactively, but then it will be all behind the scenes for you, no pop-ups. So I was covering the fact that so a new user and a page needs access to Graph and my app. He will get 2 pop-ups. Yes. You need to do 2 different consents for the first time only. No problem. So here we say always try to get the token silently. That's the pattern that we have for Msl. If it fails to do silently, go and get it. And there is a very specific error that is thrown. So you need to catch that error. If you don't catch that error, then it will just fall through. You need to say if that error is of a specific instance, at least for JavaScript and TypeScript, that's the format. For .NET, you have to just catch the exception in a different way. I try catch exception EX if it's X dot message equals X specific value. That's how you do it. And then once you do the silent and it fails, it falls through into the interactive session and you do it. And then if it totally fails, then you throw the error message. Okay, let's go back to our browser to see what's next. So we've done that. Now we need to handle the redirect promise. And I think this one is going under the functions again. Oh, code. This one goes under code. Okay. Just before code here. Format again. Make sure to save regularly because if you don't save, you might break something. And then get messages from graph. This is the actual code that implements the go and get me my graph data. And here we pass the access token. Simple. I'm surprised we'll still need to handle that ourselves. Be a little bit more specific, Bolt. So here we pass the access token and we say what the callback will be once the call completes. We in effect wrap the endpoint and then we call directly the graph endpoint. Important note here, you can actually use the Graph SDK for TypeScript to do these calls for you. You don't have to unroll your HTTP requests. This is one of the ways to do it. The difference here is that you can actually see what's happening, and you can see the different steps. And as you can see here, we have the yeah, it is the way that it's been configured. Bolt, it's acquiring the token silently, and then if it falls through, you need to well, it's not a login page. It is a consent page, or if the token has expired or the account has expired, then yes, you get a login page. So here we say this is the call. On ready state. Down here, you'll notice that we set the bearer with access token. There needs to be a space in here, otherwise it won't work. And send it. And once it completes, then just parse the text into the UI. And that will be your emails text. Let's see what else we have here. And just before the to-do add functions, we need to add the handle the response and the sign in and the sign out. This is the juice here. Let's put it at the total end. It's just before. So let's do that. No, I did not want to do that. I want to do Alt-Shift-F. And I don't want to search for anything. Let's hide that. So what do we have here? We have the handle the response. The request comes in. The response comes in from the login, and we change the UI accordingly. We also set the username. Down here we have the sign in. You'll notice that it's only 2 lines of code, right? Technically it's that with a pop-up, and then handling the response. If there's an error message, throw the error message. You'll notice that by default we go for a pop-up, and that's the recommended flow. If you want to do redirect, especially certain browsers cannot handle pop-up well, especially on mobile devices. So for those browsers, it's recommended that you use redirect. That's why we have it there. And then finally, the sign out is less than 2 lines of code. It's just 1, right? And you just call this one, and you're done. Okie dokie. So let's see what else. If there's anything else left there, or otherwise, we're ready to run our application. Oh yeah, we need to register our app. Yeah, that's a minor detail. So for that, I'm just gonna open another browser. So the code is done. Now we just need to go and tell Azure Id that we're going to use Azure Id for our sign-in and also for acquiring our emails. So for that, you can navigate to the Azure portal and go to your Azure Id, or you can do ad.portal.azure, and then select your tenant. I'm asked to sign in. Hopefully it doesn't remember me. No, it won't remember me, so I have to remember my password now. Oh God. Password managers for the win. And then here, I'm just gonna open my password. I also have 2-factor authentication, so it will prompt me for my 2FA here. So just grab that. 2-factor authentication. So here, there. No, it should be a text message. I forgot. Too many. And that will be 986-216. Not embracing passwordless auth yet. Oh, I haven't set it up on my test tenant, but you're absolutely right. I should be doing passwordless. Sometimes showing 2-factor authentication is also useful. So what I've shown here is the application prompting me for a 2-factor authentication without me coding anything. And that is very important. As a developer, you don't want to have to hand-roll your own 2-factor authentication or MFA. And that's the beauty here. Azure AD or B2C can be configured to prompt users for 2-factor authentication without having to set it up as a developer. Somebody in the IT team will go and set it up, and it will allow you to do so. Therefore, it's nice to show the 2-factor authentication from time to time, Mr. Bolt. Maybe I will have another tenant that shows passwordless in the future. How about that? It's a promise. So let's go and create our app registration. I need to make this bigger. So here we have app registrations, and we'll follow along. The first thing we need to do is create a new registration. Close this. And we just need to name it something like identity exercise. Wow, Reactor. This name doesn't really matter, so you can name it whatever you want. Reactor exercise 3.1. We only want accounts in this organization, so single tenanted app. If you want to hear about multi-tenant apps and SaaS applications, we have a fantastic stream coming tomorrow with Labrina. She's a cloud advocate for our Microsoft division, so make sure to join us tomorrow at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. 9 a.m. Pacific time. 8 a.m. we have our Msl module. And then down here we want a redirect. We'll leave it empty and then we'll configure that in a little bit. So 1, 2, register, should be instant. And then we have the details that we'll need in a second. As you can see, they're highlighted here. For now, we just need to go into authentication and add the platform. This is what says our app registration, what kind of apps we're going to use to authenticate against Azure Id. And because we have a single page app, and remember our port is 3007 running on localhost, so we'll do HTTP, there's no HTTPS, localhost port 3007. And that should be down here as well, just to clarify. We don't need to check anything else. We're not using implicit grant. You'll notice your redirect URI is eligible for authorization code with Pixie. Yes, that is great news. More security. Now let's press configure. Don't forget that. That's all we need to do here. And then the last bit is API permissions. This is where we define our consent. So we already have user.id by default, and we want to add one more. So down here, we need to press add the permission. It will pop up a nice window. We want to select graph. I will go back into Raskov in a little bit, and I will explain why not. So here we have Delegate Permissions. We want to click on that. And as you can see, because we have a UI that allows us to interact with the user, and we want to select mail.read. Here, just select this one. Make sure you press the add button at the very bottom. Add permission. And remember how we talked about grant consent over here? If I wanted to do that, then I could actually grant admin consent for everyone, so nobody will be presented with a UI to request consent while they're using the application. But for now, we're not going to do that. We're going to skip it. I will very quickly go back to authentication, because I think Raskov is saying, well, you didn't ask for any tokens here. These checkboxes are only used for the implicit grant flow, which we're not using because it's not secure. So you don't have to check anything here, right? The auth flow with Pixie will allow us to acquire the tokens that we need when we need them. Yes, only for implicit flow. You'll notice that down here it says implicit, and that's the category down here, just so you're aware. So I think we have everything we need. Yes, we do. Now, before we leave the site, we have to go and grab the application ID and go back into our code and configure that. All the way at the top, you'll notice the Msl Config. So we need this. And for the authority, let's press save as always. And then for the authority, we just want to copy that. And then we'll edit the directory ID in a second. Down here. JP would like, but I remember that by heart. He does. He remembers all this by heart, which is super annoying. I like to go by the docs. And then the directory ID, which is the same as the tenant ID, and the, what did I say? Tenant ID is the same as the tenant ID. I need more coffee this morning. Okay, so that's everything we need here. 2 configuration options, and then all the code to go and interact with Graph. Save that, and we're good to rock and roll. Test the web app. Right, back to our terminal. Let me clear that. And then let's type node server.js. Our service is running, so let's jump to our website. Haha, check this out. What? Why is this complaining? No such file. This is for Reactor index HTML3. Hey, Rick Bosch. How are you doing, sir? Oh, it all says I'm signed in. You know what? I screwed up somewhere here. Why? How hard can it be? In public folder? Yeah, I don't know. Project, reactor, index. Oh, you know what? It's web. It should be web, right? Well, I don't get my emails, so that means it hasn't worked. You know what I mean? Sign in. Okay, I need to sign in with my existing account, so don't forget that. Didn't consent, that was a previously cast credential. Oh, my camera is not on the stream at all. Where's my camera? I'm not showing my camera. You guys didn't say anything. All along, I've been without I haven't even paid attention. I'm here, by the way. The voice of God. Read your email. That's the consent that we need. It's super weird, by the way. There, yeah, I am back. Okay, so it wasn't working. It's working now. I thought I was on the stream. Anyway, haven't been paying attention. I'm so focused on the chat. I haven't been paying attention to this. Now, remember we said we can also consent admin consent for this one, or provide admin consent. But I don't want to do that for now. I want everybody to go and feel the pain of consenting or agreeing to their data. So we'll accept this. And lo and behold, the reason why we couldn't see the data before is because I was already signed in, but I hadn't consented. So the browser was like, you already have a valid ID token, but then I had to refresh the page and I had to sign out and sign in. So I could get that. So there you have it. It's all working there. And this is all my sample data from my test tenant. Exercise done. Right, let's move on to the next task and see what it is. This should actually be serving from web. I don't know why it hasn't. Anyways, weird. Make sure you stop this one because the next exercise will be like this. So, what's next? We've done that. We accept the permission. We don't want to, yeah, more points. Exactly, getting closer. We went through the permissions, we saw the data. It also says here that you can sign in with a user that doesn't have admin consent, so you can see the difference in the UI. If you do have a test tenant, you can actually do that. If you go to your users, let me close this one and this one. Here, users, because I have a test tenant, you'll see I have all these random users. I could use one of them. Where do you specify which flow was used in that sample? Because you're using the single page application, then automatically it sets up for authorization code flow, right? We'll do a console app later on so you can see the difference there. But in this instance, when you say I want to use a web app or a single page application, it will use the authorization code flow if it's supported by your framework. Okay, now, next exercise. Is there a test? There's a test in the end. Okay, don't forget the test. You need to get the points. Which of the following statements is correct about consent? Only users can grant consent for an app to act on their behalf. No one can grant access for another user. Users can consent or can grant permissions to an app that requested as long as the user has the permission. And users can grant permission consent to an app that requested regardless if the user has or doesn't have the permission. Which of the following options isn't good practice to adopt when it comes to permissions? Only ask for the permissions required for implemented app functionality. It says isn't good practice. So it's a trick question. When requesting permissions for app functionality, you should request the least privilege. It should be least privilege access. Pull request for this one later. When registering apps with Azure Id, it's a good idea to always use the admin consent option so users are not bothered with permission consent requests. I mean, that's not wrong if you're doing it for certain scenarios. Right, and this one. Apps should gracefully handle scenarios when the user doesn't grant consent to the app when permissions are requested. We can move on to the next one. Hope everybody got it right. It's the last one. If they don't consent, they shouldn't get handled nicely. Yeah, just kick them out. If you don't get my my permissions, you're out. Delegated permissions and consents. So delegated permissions is what we saw there in the graph. In effect, we ask the application to go and grab permissions on the user's behalf or on behalf of. So for example, users can give, can grant app delegated permissions to user.read and enables the user to, in the app, to go and sign in and read user's profile. And then user read basic all allows the user of the app to read basic profile information about all the other users in the organization. Sometimes in Outlook, for example, you want to read other people's information, like you want to see their profile. Sometimes I check where what org they work on or what their team structure is or who else works with them. So that information is quite nice to have in Outlook. So depending on the application, this is where it comes super handy. User consent. If the user has not previously granted the permission to the app, or an administrator has not granted access, then they are presented with this information, which we saw in the past, in the previous exercise. And when they select the access button, the consent settings are saved and the user won't be prompted again, unless somebody goes and deletes the enterprise application for that, and then they will be re-prompted for that permission. So static consent. Let's talk about V1 and V2 endpoints and static consent. Now, in the previous exercise, we had to come here and add the permissions explicitly into our app registration. This is because we needed to get access to our emails, and there you can have it. So the idea is that up front, you say what kind of permissions you're going to use, and this was mainly how the V1 endpoint worked. So if I delete the enterprise app in my solution, so Rasko, if I go into, so let's go back to our app. I know that's a little bit confusing, but it's like, what happens if you want to force a consent across the board for everyone, right? So if you go into your app registrations, I don't want to leave the preview. I want to say create it on today. So let's, no, that's the wrong one. Here. And then if I go into my, there. So that's my enterprise app. So that's my service principal, service principals. This is service, sorry. This is where we define all the consents and permissions. So in a single tenant app, this gets automatically created. And when you come here, it's a copy of the actual app registration. And then if I were to delete this one, then it will force a consent across the board. And you know, this is the down here you see the permissions. And you notice that as a user, I have consented for only one user so far in my tenant has accepted or consented to these permissions. This is where you can see them. So if I delete this one, it means that the next time I go back, it will force me to reconsent. So that was a little bit of a trip to go there. Okay, so with static consents, you had to request, and with the V1 endpoint, you had to request all the scopes up front, and then they had to be accepted. That problem there is that it's not particularly flexible and dynamic, and it doesn't make it easy for developers to build stuff. Now, as we move to the V2, we didn't want to break the previous applications. Yes, it will automatically create it the next time that somebody tries to access the app. So for V1 apps, or for apps that were created with the V1 and where you had to request everything up front, we didn't want to break that model. We didn't want to force people to re-register their apps. So we have the .default scope. There's a fantastic blog post by my other half and partner in crime, JP, where we talk about default. I will put on the chat because it goes to a great length explaining why you should or you shouldn't use .default and when do you need to use that .default scope. So make sure to have a look. but the whole premise there is that this is only used for console applications, or when there is no user interaction, we need to request the access token, or when you're in a V1 to V2 migration scenario and you want to request the scopes upfront. I'm losing my too many windows now. Let's see, which one am I not? There you go. Cool. Let's go back to this one. So the .default will be used in certain scenarios where we either have client credential flow, so your daemons or your console applications with no user interaction, or when you migrate from V1 to V2 and you still want the ability to request all the permissions up front. However, this is not as flexible. We did say there could be very well a scenario that we may want to only grab the user's consent for, say, reading the emails in the first part of the application. And then later on, we might want to ask for another consent to go and read their emails for another permission. We also don't have to define these permissions in the app registration anymore. So as long as, especially for first-party APIs like Graph, I can always go and ask it without configuring that API permission in the app registration. So that's what dynamic consent is. I can request an access token and pass a scope, and as long as I pass the right scope and something that the user has permission to access, then it will happen. So let's say user.read, I don't have to define it there. I can always go and request the user.read permission or the mail.read, and because it doesn't require admin consent, anybody can use the application. And that means that in effect, we as developers have the ability to only ask for the permissions that the app needs at the time that it needs it. So not all the time. And you don't have to do it up front. And you start with a minimal, and then you can build up your app as it goes through. So there you go. Which means that we can now go and do our exercise. In fact, before we do our exercise, I would say let's take a quick 5-minute break so that everybody can get some fresh water and do the necessary, stretch your legs, and I will see you back here at 3 minutes to 11. Thanks, everyone. back. I hope everybody had a good break. Got some water, some coffee, stretch their legs. There's an API to see everything. Everything that happens on Azure Id, there's probably an API. If there isn't one, then it's on its way very soon. But yes, there is a way to interact and see who has consented and not consented and all that jazz. So both viewing and reading and creating and editing app registrations is all available via the Graph API. Yes, everything is in the Graph these days, by the way. Okay, so we're good. Let's go back into our shameless plug here for JP, obviously. Fantastic blog post. So here we're going to do our exercise right now. And in this exercise, we're going to create delegated permissions and consent. Single page app we did before. This time I think we're going to do, we're going to edit this one and create dynamic consent, static permissions. Create an Azure AD application. Let's start with that. So in Azure AD, new registration, down here. Identity exercise 2. What did I name the previous one? Reactor exercise 3.1. Let's do reactor exercise 3.2. Let me make this slightly bigger. And then accounts in the same organization, single tenant app. That is right. And then just press create or register down here. We have the information we need. Now, in the manage authentication, the difference here is very small to the previous one, so you could edit the previous one if you wanted, but let's keep it clean. Let's do a brand new registration. So down here, we need to go to the authentication again. We need to add a platform again, because we're going to be using the exact same app that we're using before. It is going to be a single page application, and the redirect URI, HTTP, it's HTTP. We're running localhost, and then port 3007. And then down here, we don't need to check anything else. Single page up, and then press configure. So that will go and set up the authentication flow for us. Next, we need to add some permissions. Go back to our API permissions, and you'll see we have Microsoft Graph, and then we have the user.id, which is the default always. And we want to add, again, a delegated permission. And down here, we're going to do mail.id again. Let's add that permission. So it's done. Now we need to update our SPA. The only thing that we need to change is the app registration or the client ID. So let's go into the overview. Let's grab our application or client ID, back to our code, and then here we need to change that. Done and done. And what is next? We'll say run it. So we don't need to change the directory ID, it remains the same. We're in the same tenant, and let's test the app now. So here, make sure you stop the previous one running. Let's do a node server.js. And now if we go back to our application, I will sign out. Now don't sign out all the way, because that will actually delete your account. Sorry, it will remove everything and you have to re-sign in from scratch. Whereas if you just stop there and then go back to the previous website will remove the cookie and delete the local account, but it will not remove your signed-in account from Azure AD if you follow this this format. So localhost 3007, we will be prompted to re-sign in, but it will remember us since we signed in. We remain signed in. There you go. Since it's the first time we're using a brand new application, delete your account. It's not going to delete your account. It's going to delete your cookie. Yes, Bolt. Sorry, I need to find the right words here. I apologize. I will be a lot more explicit, just for you, Bolt. So again, we need to consent to read the email and the other permissions to read our profile. Accept, and we got our messages. Now we could change that to go, or we can change that, or part of the exercise will be to change that to read something else. We've done that. Oh, that's for admin consent. Yeah, I know you're giving me a hard time. Somebody needs to give me a hard time since JP is not here. So I consent it as a user, right? I can also, remember, there's a way for us to consent as admins. So let's go and test the admin format. Now, you will need to be an admin on your tenant in order to do that. So I will open Notepad. I will make this big. We'll paste that URI there, and then I need to go and grab my application ID, which is here. And what we're doing here in effect is we're saying for this specific application ID, I want to send the user to the admin consent URL to consent for everybody else. Now, if I grab that and put in the browser, yeah, if I mess up, I'll bring down Azure Id for everyone. So no mistakes. Review request permissions for your org. Slightly different messaging here, right? We're providing access to the Id email for everyone, and then I'm accepting this permission on behalf of the whole organization. Done. Everybody's got it now. Now, interesting thing. Because I have the application running on my local environment, it's going to work. If you go back into the URL, it will say, what do you want me to do once I sign, once you do the consent? If you were to send that URL to your admin with this thing over there, obviously it could be an app running on a publicly accessible URL. But let's say if you were to send that with a wrong URL, they will experience a bad flow there because they will consent and then they will be thrown into 404 not found, or I don't know where you're going. So just be aware that whatever that redirect URI is, it's a functional redirect, so your admins can see what happens once they accept that. Or if they do it through the portal, you don't have to worry about this. But that's one way to do it, through the admin consent URL. So next we're going to look into the dynamic permissions. So here, let me just stop the currently running app. It says Control-C. We'll follow the instructions. Update the SPA to show calendar events instead of email. Okay, that should be fairly straightforward to do because they tend to have the same kind of JSON structure. So they both have subjects. So if you look into the graph config, let's just go and read that. So to do that, do a search for messages and then replace it with events. If we go back into our browser, let's do a search into code. It's only one place, and we want to change this with events. There you have it. Pam, pam, pam. What else do we need to do? So you'll notice I haven't gone back into Azure Id to change anything, right? We're just saying in the code, I want to go and grab my messages instead of email. Technically with dynamic consent, as we said before, you don't have to configure them up front in the application. So let's see if that's going to work. So have we saved this one? I have saved this one. Let me just go back to the console. Server.js, and then let's go back to our page, which is here. It's not going to work. We need to sign out and sign in again. Remember, don't sign out all the way. So now if I sign in with my tenant account. Oh, you know what? Can anybody tell me why it didn't work? We missed a step. But I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think why it didn't work. So we requested to read the messages in the code, right? Let's see if anyone was paying attention, and then I will tell you why it didn't work. So here we said, I want to go and read my events. I did not ask for the right scope in the call. That's very good, Mr. Bolt. So here I haven't updated this one to actually prompt for the right permissions, because we still have the mail.read and we have already consented for that. It meant that this call will have failed. In fact, we may have seen an error message coming in. Not there, but if we open the browser, I bet that we'll see the error message in F12. Failed to load resources. No, that's not the right one. Let's refresh and see what happens. Ha! That nice error message there. What does it say? Now we have we have the right, well, we have an access token, but we don't have the right access token. What was the error message? Forbidden. We don't have access to read calendar data yet because we did not consent to it. So let's go and fix that. Well done, Bolt. You win question of the day today. Just kudos, nothing else. You already have the t-shirt and the mug. Okay, let's go and fix our code. So here, in fact, let's go back to the instructions because I did go through very quickly. Now we need to update the calendars, the rate. Not calendar, it's calendars. Specific attention to detail. Let's save this one. Let's restart our service or server. It's listening. So if we go back to our app now, too many of them. Remember, we had to sign out to prompt that permission again. Oh, I signed out all the way. God. Well done, Chris. It's fine. It's easy. We'll use my password manager. Find the window, paste it, do the two-factor authentication. Oh, it prompt. Oh, I didn't see the pop-up blocker there. Interesting. Thank you. So 446780. And notice, lo and behold, now it's asking permission to read our calendar. It hasn't removed the previous permission, by the way. Just because it's not asking for it doesn't mean that it's not going to be there. It just means that it doesn't have to request consent to email. It just asks the new permission that we just added. So if I say I accept, then we should see our calendar events. Monday morning meeting, another Monday morning meeting. There you have it. It's all working out of the box. And this is how you can iteratively add more and more permissions into your application, especially if you have multiple APIs and multiple resources that you need to access. Make it as close to that call as possible to go and acquire the token. So we tested the web app. We've signed in. We saw the calendar prompt there as well. And accept and read the emails. Try the admin consent experience. Again, we can do that. Why not? We'll follow the instructions here again. So put it onto there. And then I need to replace the application ID with the right one. So let's go and grab it from our AAD. That's the one there. We could add it, we could get it from the code, by the way. It should be the same thing. And now if I prompt the user, maybe in your window, there, in your tab. I'm logging in. You have to be an admin. Remember that. The admin consent endpoint will only work with an admin account. Is there a mode where you can request consent progressively without the user logging out? Yeah, I didn't have to log out. It just prompted me and the pop-up blocker just stopped. So I was being a dummy. So here you'll notice that it's a different one, review for your organization. And then if you accept this app, specify resources for all users in your organization down here. See? So let's accept this one, and we're back to the app. Again, remember, if you're going to use this experience, make it good for your admins. So don't go wondering why localhost 3007 is not working for them. So let's test our knowledge. Hope everyone was following. I hope everyone was able to complete this exercise alongside with me. You can always go and do it at your own time, at your own pace, and reference back to this video. So static consent is when the permissions, what is the difference between static and dynamic consent? Static consent is when the permissions are defined ahead of time in the app registration, while dynamic consent defines the permissions as they are needed by the app. Dynamic consent is when the permissions can change over time with an app, while static consent permissions never change. Static consent refers to the permissions all users have, while dynamic permissions only apply to some users. What role does the .default scope serve? The .default scope represents the basic permissions all apps need. A request for the default scope is equivalent to requesting all static permissions defined in the app registration. So it seems that you should not acquire all tokens at the beginning of an app. That is correct. In effect, you should be dynamically requesting those permissions as the application needs them, as close to the call as possible, right? Unless you're working with something like let's say a console app, where you have to request the mail.read and calendar and everything else up front, because you have to use the .default, and you have to predefine these in the application itself. Very important. So for console applications, you will have to use the .default option. We talked about the best practices around consent, which is well, not every API call. So if you're, let's say you have all your calendar information from Graph, and then you need to call into one of your APIs to go and get some other data. For that call, you probably want to request a token closer to that time. And then once that token is in the cache, you don't have to worry about that again in the application itself. But yes, the first time that you call that your own API access token, it will be probably close to one of the calls, but then again, you could call your API further down the line or on a different page, and because you already have the access token, it will acquire it silently for you and pass it down. Hope that makes sense. So continue. What's left? Application permissions and consent. So now we're passing into the non-delegated side of things. This is where we are having an application requesting permissions on our behalf. And some high privilege permissions will require admin consent. For example, at Microsoft, a lot of the permissions that we've been working to get today, not today, but the permissions that we'll be seeing in a bit, will require admin consent. And for that, there is a lengthy process to submit a request. You need to also provide reasoning why you want to have access to 220,000 worth of email accounts or graph data for users. So they have a very rigorous process about provisioning these kind of permissions. Different organizations will have different requirements, some rigid, some less rigid. But the whole point is that because applications tend to usually act across multiple accounts, they tend to require admin consent. And although a consumer user might grant an application access to this kind of data, organizational users are restricted from granting access to the same set of sensitive company data. That is, that's a great summary about why you can't. So if you don't get admin approval prior to running your application, you will be presented with that, need admin approval, and you won't be able to proceed further down the line. I also said that since these permissions require admin consent, you need to have good reasoning about why you want to do them. So remember, least privilege is very important. Okay, so the admin consent, again, we saw that before, and very similar format here. Just make this full page here so everybody can see it. And we're sending the admin consent to a specific tenant with a client ID, and we say, please provide consent for all these scopes. That's the admin point. Or they can do it in the portal down here, which I think it's a lot easier, and most of the admins will do it like that. You can also do it programmatically, I think. Recommend signing user into your app. This is something I mentioned before. When you request your admins to go and sign in, it's nice to provide a nice UI so they don't fall through the experience. Any questions with regards to application permissions? Some examples maybe I can give you is console apps, daemon services, Azure Functions, for example, acting on the behalf of multiple users, maybe running a scheduled task to go and access things like storage or Cosmos or Graph to pull data around. Anything that does not provide user interaction will need to use this flow or this permission model and consent flow as well. Let's go and write some code. Why don't we? So for this exercise, we're going to use a console app, if I remember correctly. So let's see. Who doesn't like console apps, right? We'll need to create the Azure Id application first. So let's do that. Summary of learn that everything is awesome. The summary is everything is awesome. Yeah. I'm not going to break into song, but everything is awesome. Create an Azure Id application. So we'll start with Azure Id this time, and then we'll write the code. Let's do this. Again, back to our dashboard. Let's go into app registrations, new registration. And this time we're going to name it Identity Daemon. I always get the E and the A confused on the daemon. Sounds like DEA. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm alone on this one. Then we only want a single tenant app because this one will be accessing data from a single tenant. There's no web redirect here because daemons, yes. I mean, they're pronounced exactly the same. So unless I was saying I'm going to run this daemon on a scheduled task, then you wouldn't have an idea what I'm talking about. Context is king. Okay, so here we name that. Now we need to configure the authentication, which is very different to the one that we had before. Because we are using a console application or a service, we need to add a different type of authentication, which is a mobile and desktop application. Now this includes quite a few things. Windows, UWP, console, IoT, limited device services, classic iOS, and Android. And you might say, what is the difference between this one and these ones for mobile? This is very specific to Xamarin, for example, iOS, and Xamarin Android, whereas this one is for Xamarin Forms. And these ones do not include desktop apps. Right. So here, let's click on this one. And because we're using the Msl library, you can actually go with this one, but apparently they want us to use the top one, which is this. It says Msl only. Let's be inclusive. Let's make it for everyone. Every library is accepted under the sun. Let's press save. Save. Why do I need to press save? I'm good here. You don't need to press save. Create a client secret. Right, I'm going to create it and show it to you, friends. In fact, I don't think it shows the whole thing, which is pretty cool. Although we'll have to paste in the code. So you won't be able to dox me for much longer because obviously you won't be able to run the app, but I will delete it afterwards. Make sure that if you ever create secrets in the public eye, go and change them or roll them or delete them after your stream or after the blog post or whatever. Ideally, you also want to use certificates, but for the sake of time, we're going to use a secret. So here, down here in the secrets, create a new client secret. You can actually add a name or you can leave it blank. Always make it for a year. And then down here, you'll notice it says password uploaded or create it. You will create a value and you want to copy the value, not the secret. Now I'm going to copy that into my OneNote because once you move away from here, I said I'm going to delete that, so don't get excited. Get your hacking hats ready, folks. Yeah, exactly. Bolt is our black hatter here. So we got our secrets, and then we copied it. You notice the UI is slightly different. There is a value and there's an ID. Do not copy the ID. And now we need to add some permissions. Since we are focusing on permissions today, let's see what kind of permissions does it want us to add this time. Graph. It is probably the easiest one to demo and test because we already have an API in place that returns data. In many scenarios, you'll be probably calling your own APIs and your own permissions. Yeah, oh, I've done this before, Bolt, copying the ID. So here you'll notice that instead of asking for delegated permissions, we're going into the application permissions. And we're looking for mail.read again. Now, instead of saying just the user's mailbox, it says everyone's mailbox is here, which is interesting, right? And these are very different permissions, and they all require admin consent. So down here, we need to make sure that once we do that, we add the admin consent. Otherwise, our application is not going to work because it will not be providing, there will be no way for the console app to interactively go and get those consent. I mean, you can write it to go and get the consent for you, but it's very broken if you use that flow in a console app, and you shouldn't. Okay, so we have the permissions. Remember, admin consent. So at the very top here, which is not showing up because I have the ellipsis, grant admin consent. I'm an admin on my tenant, so I can do that. And that is done. So if I were to scroll all the way to the right, you'll see that now we have admin consent requested, and then we have granted for me or for my tenant. Sorry, that's for the whole tenant. Okay, now create a headless application. Some .NET. Let's switch a little bit of context. Open up your, close this one, stop this one, and create a new directory. .NET new console.o, and then graph daemon. I'm telling you, I'm always going with an E first. And in effect, this is going to create a new console application, and it will output everything into that directory. So it will automatically create the directory for you. You can also do a .-n for name, and it will also do the same thing. So don't worry about it. It will create in the right place. Do I have faith in the .NET CLI? I do. Okay. So somewhere down here, there should be, what do we name ours? Graph something. Is that at the top? Interesting, I'm not seeing it. Ah, okay, it's there. Just weird wrapping on the text. Change the directory there, obviously, and then now I need to add a few packages. Let me just copy these because I've already changed directory, and then make this big. Paste away. Why not? It goes and grabs all the packages, and we'll explain what we grabbed and why we did it in a few seconds. Thanks for looking out for me, Raskov. Luckily, the .NET CLI created that for us by using the -o for the output. And the last one, I need to press enter. Okay, now with all this in place, let's see what we just installed. Microsoft Identity Client, that's our Msl library for clients. And if you're doing web, there's a amply named one, Microsoft.identity.web. So client is for non-web applications. That's our Msl library for desktop. Then Microsoft Graph is the library that allows you to interact with Graph. Then the three other packages are for being able to have a file and interacting with that app settings.json file, so we can put some settings in there instead of sticking them in the code. Now you could bypass the 3 last packages and put everything into the code and hard code everything, but that's not ideal. So this is why we're adding these 3. So the ability to interact with JSON, the ability to call into the file, and set up the middleware for us. I think next we just need to open code and write some code or paste some code. Yeah, I agree, Mr. Bolt. You could use Key Vault, especially since we're going to be adding a client secret, and we should not have a client secret there. So from a configuration perspective, if you were to add as an extension for Key Vault, which means that as long as the application is running under the right context, you should go and grab the sensitive information from Key Vault. We have blog posts, and we did a stream around that before. So please catch up with that and do not put secrets in your code. For the sake of this demo, we're going to use the app settings.json to put the secret there, but it is not good practice. However, it would take us about 20 minutes to go and set up Key Vault, and that's an exercise for the reader. In fact, I would encourage you to go and try that after this exercise so you can see how to set it up. Now, let's go back to our code, put it on the side because we have to do some copy pasting here. It's nice because Visual Studio Code will say, well, it seems like you're running a .NET Core app. Do you want me to go and set everything up for you? So update the console app to support Azure Id authentication. Yes. I somehow don't like this one as much because it doesn't have Azure AD at the top, so it doesn't create a section in your app settings. But that's a conversation for another time. It totally comes down to preferences on how you want to pull your secrets and your settings. And yes, this should not be there. Also, I don't like the fact that they use the application secret and application ID instead of client ID and client secret. So we're almost breaking our consistency there. But let's push this to the side and let's write some code. First thing, add an app settings to the JSON file so we can add our settings. App JSON. You can also name this file whatever you want, but it's non-conventional, right? So it will be unconventional if you like. First thing we're gonna do here is let's add our secret, because why not? We're doxed ourselves once, let's dox ourselves twice. And I will be deleting that secret afterwards, so don't get your hopes up, my hacker friends. We'll do the rest of them in a bit. Oh, what happened there? Oh, interesting. Yeah, I know. I will close the file browser. Right, let's say next. We need to add these, okay? Update the properties, fine. That was what I was planning to do anyway. So here, if we go back into the overview, always in the overview, you can find the properties. Let's go. We have application ID or client ID. See, we're not even consistent in our UI. I know. Let me just close this. So we have the application ID there, and then the tenant. If it was JP, he would probably know that tenant by heart now, and will make me look silly, but it's fine. I can't be bothered with learning these things. There. Okay, so we have the tenant ID, i.e. where are we going to sign in, the application ID, which application are we going to use, and then the application secret, so we can use client credential flow for our application. Create a new folder called helpers. Oh, help me God. Every application needs some helpers, right? And these helpers are actually going to help us acquire the token and pass it down to the graph because we need to have a way to do that. Our graph won't work without an access token, and that's the whole point. And in .NET, it's a little bit more involved. So here we have an Auth Handler. So let's go and create a new file called authhandler.cs. And you can just copy paste the whole thing. In effect, what this one is doing, it will try to get an authentication provider, set it, and then it will use the authentication provider to go and request the token for us. And this is going to be used by Graph itself. So we directly we're not going to call this one. This authentication handler will be passed to the Graph client, so it can go and acquire the tokens, and then every request with a graph will use the access token to make the calls. So it's abstracting a little bit the manual effort. You could very well just do Msl go and acquire token silently yourselves, and then call the graph via HTTP directly, or pass this way is the passing the authentication handler to the graph. So here we have an Msl authentication provider, which is of type iAuthentication provider. This means that once we sign in into Azure Id with our account, or client credentials in this case, then we're using the max the VS Code. We will use the Msl token to go and get it. The reason why we're doing it like this, it's because the graph client also has its own authentication providers, which can be of other types, and therefore it could cause a little bit of friction there about which ones you're going to use. I like to use Msl because once you authenticate with Msl, then all you have to do is just go and acquire the tokens, which has been a recent addition. But in the past, you had to use the graph-specific authentication provider, which was a little bit annoying, considering that I already authenticate in the front end. Now I have to go and re-authenticate to go and grab an access token. So the Msl through and through is quite nice. So here I need to create, let's see, it says Msl authentication provider.cs in helpers. So we'll do that. And yeah, I totally, I mean, I could reduce the zoom in, but it won't show as much. Maybe you can do that. And I think that's still legible there, right? More or less. Okay, so let's copy this one, and we need to add a new file in the helpers called Msl authentication provider.cs. And funnily enough, I can screw up the name and it will still work because the name does not correspond to the actual class file. Okay, so in here, what we're doing is we're creating an Msl authentication provider. We're passing the confidential client, which will be instantiated in our in another class, and then we're using the Msl provider to go and get a token and then pass the token into the header of the request. Again, they all work side by side, and you'll see how this gets implemented and brought together with the graph client. So here we got that. So next we need to go and incorporate Microsoft Graph into the console app. We just need to add the following method in the load settings in the program. So I think the rest of the code just goes into the program. So here we need to add a new method, and you can resolve with control dot, or you can add them directly yourselves. Oh no, that's fine. Load app settings. Oh, I went too far. Should be there. Okay, so in effect, what this one will do is, yeah, I did in the class, thanks man. So what this will do here is go and load the settings from our app settings.json file, or whatever name you give your file. And then it will grab the application ID, application secret, tenant ID, and target user ID, which we'll grab in a second. But for now, it checks whether these have been set, and then it just returns null. If otherwise, it just throws an exception. Okay, now what do we have next? We need to add a method in the program, which will create a graph client. Add the missing control dot, add the missing references or usings, and this is from Msl. So in here, we are creating a confidential client. We craft the authority up here, so we know where we're going to sign in. we're building that. We also say that we want to use a secret instead of a certificate. If you were to use a certificate, you would do it here with certificate. And you can write some code. In fact, I have a blog post about how to do that in the console app, so you don't have to use your secrets, which is not the preferred way. Again, please avoid secrets when you can. And finally, so we get the instance there, we get that, and this will be passed into the client. So that's the next step. Create the graph client so that we can go and call something. There you go. And this method will get the graph service client instantiated for us. Okay. Get authenticated graph client. It calls into this, and then it returns a graph service client, a graph client instance with the appropriate authentication provider, which will automatically go and grab the access tokens for us, and we don't have to worry about the whole flow. It's all handled by us or by the code that we just wrote or pasted. Now in the main method, add the following code to the end of the main method to load the configuration settings from the app settings.json. Okay. So this one will load our settings, which we have down here as a method. And then it will throw if the config is null or show an error message. Next we have the client, get authenticated graph client. So now we're putting everything together so they will nicely run end to end. So this one is calling into here, which is calling into the previous one. You can see how it goes. And finally, let's go and get some messages. So copy that. With our graph client now in tow, we can just go and grab the user's email, targeted user ID. That's very important. We need to set that up before we run the code. We're getting the messages, and then we get the data here using our requests, and then we loop over the emails to send them to the console. Now, one last step is to go and grab the user's ID. So we do .NET Build first. Will it build? Wait, save. Don't forget to save. God, I always do that. Okay, apparently it works. We can copy paste code. It's like pros. We have that. Let's go and get a user. So it does say, go into your Azure Id portal and select the user you want to play with. It's ready to ship it. Yeah, exactly. How was your day, Dave? Oh yeah, I wrote a graph app, ready to ship. So back into our Azure Id tenant. Let's go into our users. So we go with Adele. God, everybody has the same. I'm just kidding. It's a test tenant. We'll go with Lee. How about Lee? So Lee has an object ID of blah. So you need to copy the object ID, by the way, right? And then you need to paste that into the target user in the config file. Here. There you go. Yes, done and done. If I remember correctly, the next step is just to run the app. And it is indeed. .NET run. It's all here. All good. We got it. We got our data. Hopefully you were able to get to the same happy result that we went through the exercise just now. Just wanted to see where we are requesting the scope. It should be in the program. Okay, so the whole point was for us to see this, right? Let me zoom in on line 51. So remember how we talked about application permissions and the use of default? Well, the whole gist of that, the whole point of us writing all that code or copy pasting all that code was to show that when an application is running, because there's no user interaction and because we need to have prior admin consent, we have to use the .default to request the permissions up front. And this is how it's put together. So we have an end-to-end solution that shows you how to use the confidential client with a client secret to run and go and run an application that goes and asks for permission or already acquires permissions via the .default scope to interact with your data. There you have it. So I think that's the last step. And then we have the summary. Test your knowledge. Application permissions differ from delegated permissions in all except which of the following ways? Application permissions are for when there is no user interaction. With delegated permissions, while delegated permissions involve interaction of a signing user. Application permissions are granted by a user to the application to act on their behalf, while delegated permissions are granted by an application to a user. If anybody understands what that sentence says, please explain it to me. And application permissions are higher privileged permissions than delegated permissions. It's definitely not that one. Now, what does the question ask? Application permissions differ from delegated permissions in all except which of the following ways? I'll go with this one. Let me know what you go with. To grant application permissions, which of the following statements isn't a valid option? Send a user to the application consent endpoint with the proper parameters on the query string. Send a user to the admin consent endpoint with the proper parameters on the query string. And select the Grant Admin Consent button within the Azure Id Admin Center. That will... Azure Id Admin Center? It's like Azure Id Portal. Okay, the Azure Id Admin Center, fine, we'll go with that terminology, that will display an admin consent. Okay, so it says which of the following statements isn't a valid option. I'll go with the first one. Did everybody else get it right? You can always retry if you didn't get it right. Okay, summary. Let's do this. Fairly straightforward, right? We learned that the Microsoft Identity Platform is in fact built on top of OAuth 2 when it comes to interacting and acquiring access tokens. We have to use the API permissions when we need to request access to certain APIs. We also learned about the static consent, the V1 endpoint, and how when you go from V1 to V2, you have to use the .default to keep the experience consistent. However, if you are writing applications today using the V2 endpoint, which is the recommended way, then we expect you to use the dynamic consent. And that means that you can either define the API permissions up front, or you can set them up in your code and request them on the fly as you need them in your application. We also looked at the best practices, least privilege, always keep the API permissions as close to your call as possible. Do not ask for permissions that your code does not implement. Dynamic consent is something that was added as part of the V2 endpoints and the iteration of Azure Id. So it is fairly new, that is right. It's not new. It's not that something that came out last month, but it's been out there since the support of V2 endpoint and Msl. So it's a different experience, and it definitely creates a better programming model and a better permissioning model in the tenant. So please make sure you look at the survey. In fact, I have 2 slides that I need to show you. The bosses have spoken, and I need to deliver. So first and foremost, if you enjoy this series, it will be on YouTube later on. And we're also going to be back next Monday to look into the next module, module 4. Make sure to join us next Monday at the same time and the same place. It will be live streamed. If you miss it, you can always do it on your own time. We also have a Discord channel. So in fact, we have a Discord channel dedicated to this MS Learn module. So if you want to join Discord, which you can find the link at the very top of the stream, aka.ms425, so Discord join. It means that you can always reach out to us if you have questions or you don't understand some of the terminology that we covered through the 3 modules so far. Or if you have general IT questions, even IT will support you. General identity questions, we're happy to support you there as well. There is a survey. Please make sure to take the survey because that helps us and means that we can come back and do more of these things, maybe more advanced scenarios and more in-depth modules. And there's also a whole heap of Reactor workshops that you can catch online. So surveys do count quite a bit. Make sure to join the community and make sure to sign up for upcoming events. And that's the survey link here again, in case you missed it. Yes, it is on the chat and it is here as well. So ak.ms reactor or ak.ms/reactor/survey, and there's a specific code 13137. Sounds like a radio host announcer. And yeah, that's it. I mean, thanks everyone for joining today. I hope you learned something new. I hope you had fun playing with the code. You can always go back and do it on your own time. Join us on Discord if you have questions. And thanks again to the Reactor team for allowing us to do these workshops. It's always fun to have you as an audience, and we really appreciate your time with us. Thanks everyone. Take care and have a happy week. Bye.